Our speaker today is Professor Russell Roberts. Professor Roberts received his BA from the University of North Carolina and his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He is currently a professor of economics at Mason University, and he's the J. Fish and Lillian F. Smith Distinguished Scholar from the Mercatus Center and a research fellow at Stanford University's Cooper Institution. Before coming to George Mason, Professor Roberts was at Washington University in St. Louis, University of Rochester, Stanford University, and UCLA. His academic work has been published in the Journal of Political Economy, Journal of Law and Economics, and Public Choice, to name a few. In addition, he has written 3 novels, The Price of Everything, A Parable of Possibility and Prosperity, The Invisible Heart, and The Choice. All 3 novels incorporate economic theories and public policy issues into works of fiction. Professor Roberts is the host of a weekly podcast series called Econ Talk, and he blogs at Cafe Hyatt. I highly encourage you to go and check those out. They're very, very informative and entertaining. And today, Professor Roberts is going to talk with us on an important issue: crony capitalism versus real capitalism, and lessons from the financial crisis. And with that, I'll present to you Professor Russell Roberts.
Thanks, Pete. It's really great to be here. I think it's maybe my first time in Charleston, certainly my first time here at the College of Charleston. It's a beautiful campus, beautiful place, beautiful city. And our topic for today is the financial crisis. And I figure I'll talk 3 or 4 hours, kind of dip into it a little bit. It's a little complicated, you know. There's a lot of moving parts, so I'll do my best I can. Seriously, I'm hoping I'll cover it and give you an idea of what I think are the important issues related to Adam Smith's insights in about 30 to 40 minutes, and that'll leave us some time for questions. If you're in the back, you can come on down and sit here in the aisle. You can sit here at my feet. You know, I don't get that very often, so that's pretty exciting. If anyone wants to come down here and sit up front, I won't call on you, I promise, and I won't spit either. Come on down. It's really, you don't want to stand for the 3 hours. It's awkward. You're going to get hungry, and come on. So, Adam Smith, when you think of Adam Smith, what do you think of? Call it out. What do you think of? Visible hand. That's his biggest idea. Kind of a strange thing, right? Because how many people here have read chunks of or some amount of The Wealth of Nations? I've read the whole thing. Come on, honestly. As a few people are very impressed. Even the digression on silver, it's so boring and complicated. But the invisible hand is only mentioned once in The Wealth of Nations, but it kind of runs through it. How many people have read his other book, major book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, or dipped into it, read some of it? I actually like that one better as I get older. That's probably why. It's in there too. And if anything, it's in there more explicitly, ironically, and yet most people associate it with The Wealth of Nations. Now, what I'm going to try to do in this talk is give you the flavor of what I think the invisible hand has to tell us about the financial crisis, which a lot of people are trying to do that in different ways. Now, when I talk about the invisible hand, I'm not talking about various parodies of the invisible hand. I'll give you the 2 that I don't like. One is, if you could give me a 3-word parody of the invisible hand, what would it be? Anybody have an idea? Greed is good, because it leads to good things. Greed is good. That is not the invisible hand. The fact that greed is good can lead to good things is not the invisible hand. If anything, greed is good is Ayn Rand. And the greed is good can lead to socially beneficial things is Bernard Mandeville, who wrote before Adam Smith. Adam Smith's insights in the invisible hand are actually a little more subtle than those 2 ideas. The real meaning of the invisible hand, and certainly the way I understand it and what I have learned from reading Smith and thinking about Smith, is that there is order in the fabric of the world. There is order in the fabric of the world that is not controlled or designed by human beings' intentions and plans. Problems can get solved and taken care of without conscious human intent, without conscious human design. Systems can be self-regulating, and that word self-regulating is an unfortunate phrase. When I go into the bank at night, if I work at the bank and they leave the vault open, which would be a mistake, right? You could say, well, it's self-regulating that I won't steal from the bank because I'm a good person. That'd be one form of self-regulation. I regulate myself. I wouldn't do that, but that's not what we mean by self-regulation. We do not mean that banks behave themselves, or corporations behave themselves, or employees behave themselves because they are self-regulating. No, it's the system that is self-regulating, and if anything, that's a technical term that means something about how the system constrains itself, and I'm going to give you a few examples of that. But how is it possible that a system could regulate itself? How can there be order without human intention or design? And this is a very alien concept to us, because in our daily lives, order only comes about if we do something. So if we have dirty dishes, we never say, oh, that's a self-regulating system. They'll just wash themselves. That's a great system. That would be a great system. We don't live in that world, right? I'd like a self-regulating lawn. It would rake itself, water itself, fertilize itself, mow itself. That doesn't happen. If we want order in our home, in our daily lives, in our apartment, in our dorm room, you got to clean it yourself. The idea that there could be problems that could be solved by people not planning to solve them is very alien. So I'm going to give you a few examples of those kind of self-regulating systems. One we know from our daily lives, it's very easy to understand, which is a thermostat. If you're sitting in your home or your apartment and you hear the air conditioning go on, you realize that does not mean, oh, well, someone must have come along and turned it on. We understand the idea of a thermostat. A thermostat automatically tempers the extremes in temperature. When it gets too hot out, the air conditioning comes on. When it gets too cold out, the heat comes on. And by the right amount. Think about how clever that is. What a brilliant... You ever appreciate it? No, you don't. You don't even think about it for a second. What an extraordinary thing it is that the hotter it is, the longer the air conditioning stays on. It would be a tremendous achievement of humanity if, when it's hot out relative to the rest of the year, it just runs. But it doesn't just run. It cuts off. And so you think, oh, someone must have gone and switched up. No. It's self-regulating. It's designed to be self-regulating. Here's another example of order, this time not so good. In Washington, D.C., you'd think, where I live, you'd think a memo goes out. Someone must have sent a memo that says, between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m., and 4 p.m. and 7 p.m., I want a bunch of people to get on the road and drive real slow. Don't go too fast. Oh, yeah, oh, good. Phew, I'm doing my job. I'm at 15. I stop every once in a while and then get going again, but not too fast. It looks like everybody got a memo. There is order there. It happens to be, in this case, not a very good order, not an order that we like particularly. The reasons for that are very interesting. Maybe we'll talk about them later. But that particular order that emerges is no one's controlled. No one sent out the memo. So I don't like it, and I'm late to a meeting or an appointment. Who do I complain to? Nobody. There's no person to blame. We all created it together. And similarly, in February, they have a thing called the Super Bowl. It is the #1 pizza day of the year. Did you know that? Pizza sales are highest on Super Bowl Sunday than any other day of the year. Imagine going into a store, a grocery, and trying to buy a bagel on Super Bowl Sunday. Well, that'd be impossible. Because all the dough for that day, all the flour, all the other materials that you need to bake stuff, well, that all went to the pizza, right? No. Somebody decided, but no, they didn't. Somebody must have decided to set aside some flour for me, who likes bagels and doesn't like pizza on Super Bowl Sunday, but no. Who do you thank? Nobody. There's nobody in church. There's no czar of flour who said, hey, Super Bowl Sunday, big day for pizza. Let's make sure the croissants and the bagel guys are getting plenty of dough. Well, it just happens. It's self-regulating. Basquiat gave a famous example. In Paris, you don't wake up in the morning and think, oh my gosh, what if there's no bread? What if all the bread got eaten by this part of town? What if all the bread got eaten yesterday? Every day, fresh bread for everybody, no matter how much you want. If I go into the store and I say, I want 36 bagels, I'm throwing a brunch today, nobody says, oh, I'm sorry. We sold all those. And if he gives them to me, they always have them. When he gives them to me, and somebody on the other side of town says, I'd like 36, then I say, oh, They gave it to that Roberts guy over on the other side of town. Sorry, you're out of luck. Who does that? Who coordinates that? Who designs that system? Nobody. It's a self-regulating system. In the case of the thermostat, anybody know anything about a thermostat? I think it's a little piece of metal inside it, right? It expands and contracts and sets off the heat and the air conditioning, I hope. Not my field. But in economics, it's the prices. The prices adjust to make sure there's stuff in the stores all the time for when we want them. It's so incredibly miraculous that we don't think to appreciate it. The result is harmony under no one's direction, no one's plan. There's planning. Each bagel person, each store, each bakery, each person using flour for 1,000 things is making their own plans, but somehow all the plans interact together in a harmonious way without anybody coordinating it from the top down. Markets tend to have feedback loops that create that harmony. The prices are the feedback loop. So if a bunch of people want to buy something who didn't want to buy it before, the price starts to go up, and that sends a signal to other people to set in motion their actions in response to those prices. And that smooths and dampens the disorder that could come for me saying, hey, I want some of what you've got. We don't fight over that stuff. Think about that, how amazing that is. The Chinese, there's been about 300 million people in China going from the rural areas into the cities. Kids going to school who never went to school before, using pencils who never used pencils before. So when I go into Staples and go buy a pencil, they never say to me, are you kidding? We sent them all to China. They're using them all this year. No, they got plenty for me, right? I don't have to go to the Chinese guys and say, hey, where are my pencils? I want them. I want them. Hey, we don't have a fight. That harmony is so beautiful. And the reason it exists is the feedback loop of price dampens and smooths and coordinates our differing desires. Those are stable feedback loops. Let me give you an unstable feedback loop from my chemistry class. When I was in high school, this happened in chemistry class. I saw it happen. I watched with a mixture of horror and delight. In the chemistry lab, faucets, handles, hoses attached to them. Two people are filling up a beaker or some kind of thing with a hose, and they're working the handle. And some mischievous person, not me really, not me, got the hoses all tangled up on purpose, so that one person who is filling up the hose thinks that this lever is working the hose, but it's not. It's really working the other person's hose. And similarly, this person's working that hose. So what this person sees is that the water's getting less and less. So he's turning it up higher and higher. That's filling up the other guy's higher and higher, and he's turning his down. So all of a sudden, this guy's got nothing. He's got his at the max. The other guy's got his at... That's unstable. That's chaos. That's bad feedback loops. You don't want that. In the financial sector, in the world of investment, there are feedback loops of profit and loss that create stability. We have in capitalism, we should have, under real capitalism, profit and loss. Some people say it's a profit system. It's not. It's a profit and loss system. The possibility of profits encourages risk-taking. The possibility of loss encourages prudence, caution. You want prudent risk-taking. You don't want reckless risk-taking. The profits encourage people to take a chance. The losses encourage them to be careful. Those are the feedback loops that make the system reliable. It's like a thermostat. Now, we're going to go into a little example here of how these feedback loops work with borrowing. Okay, let's say I want to borrow money. I'm going to make an investment. I have to decide whether to make the investment at all. And if I make the investment, I have to decide how much to invest. Now, one of the things that's great, if I'm making that decision, I could use my own money, but if I can, I'd like to use somebody else's money, right? And when I use somebody else's money, I could take them on as an investor, or I could take them on as a borrower. Okay? They'd lend me the money rather than buying a share in my enterprise. Why do I want somebody to lend me money instead of taking a share? Anybody? What's the advantage of borrowing as opposed to issuing stock? Control is one. What else? Leverage, which means what? I don't have to put so much in. I get a big kick for a very little amount of money. What was the answer? Something out here? Profit. Why? I get all the upside. If it's a great investment, I get it all. Okay? With a borrower, and I'm going to use these terms, I'm going to use a bunch of terms independently. To mean the same thing. A creditor, a lender, a bondholder. Creditor, lender, bondholder. They all have the same thing in common that's important for this conversation. They give me money, a lender or a bondholder. All right, I sell them a bond or I borrow money from them. They give me money. What do I give back? If it's a lender or a bondholder, what do I give back? Who said interest? Interest. How much interest? It depends. We agree on that in advance, but it's fixed. Once you lend me the money, once you buy my bond, it's fixed. So you get none. You're the lender. You're the bondholder. You get nothing of the upside. So what do you care about if you're a lender or a bondholder? You care about one thing. What is it? Risk. What aspect of risk is the one part you're worried about? Bankruptcy. As long as the thing is a going concern, you get back what? Your interest and your principal. That's all you care about because you don't get anything else. You don't get the upside. So you are, as a lender or a bondholder, you are the watchdog of recklessness because that's all you're worried about. If you see me starting to act recklessly as with your money, you take it away. You stop. I can't borrow. If I start getting riskier with what I invest in, you don't want to keep lending me money for a fixed amount because you don't get that upside, and you've raised the chance you're going to get wiped out. So in financial markets, bondholders, lenders, are the watchdogs of recklessness because that's all they care about. They just want to make sure you stay solvent. You keep your enterprise a going concern. So as an investor, as the guy who's looking for money, I love to be able to borrow, right? But of course, because I like to have, what do we say, leverage, profit, control. But of course, the lender knows that, right? There's a feedback loop. If I get out of control, they start to say, whoa, we're not so happy about that. And I'll find it more and more difficult to attract money to play my game. So borrowing is great for me. Lender thinks, ooh, careful. So the lender always is going to be very cautious. The lender is going to look for my behavior, my collateral, my assurances. How am I going to convince the lender to borrow money? I got to convince the lender that I'm going to be able to pay it back. And to do that, I've got to convince them that I'm going to survive. So something funny happened between 1995 and 2005. Between 1995 and 2005, lenders and bondholders continued to lend money and buy the bonds for investments that were increasingly risky. And they did not ask for a particularly larger premium, a larger interest rate, even though the actions that the people borrowing the money were doing were getting riskier and riskier. Now, the housing market is a key part of this. I'm trying to stay away from it. I'm just going to say a couple quick things about it. If I'm buying a house with very little money down, I am putting your money as the lender at risk. If I put 20% down, you're much happier than if I put 5. And you're much happier if I put 3. And you're much, much happier if I put 0 and borrow the closing costs. Okay? And those are the things that happened between 1995 and 2005. More and more people were borrowing money with less and less money down, including 0. Now, it's a very bizarre thing to lend money to somebody with no skin in the game, which is what 0 is, right? 0 money down means you're renting with my money and taking and gambling with my money as the lender. You're taking my money and hoping it appreciates. The house does. It should be great for you. Obviously, this is a great deal for you, the home buyer, the borrower. But as the lender, I'm thinking, what am I doing here? And yet people did this in increasing amounts. They rolled those loans and mortgages into a package called mortgage-backed securities, which people bought with borrowed money. So the financial well, how many people here own a lot of mortgage-backed securities? Yeah, not too many, right? The people who bought these were large financial institutions: Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, J.P. Morgan, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Citibank, Bank of America. They were buying these packages of mortgages that were full of people who either were bad credit risk or had put very little money down. And they bought them with great enthusiasm. Why did they do that? And I'm going to give you two answers. The first answer is they didn't realize that the stuff they were buying wasn't really safe. They thought it was safe. It looked safe. It was called safe. It was called AAA. It was rated AAA. They were careless. Or they were incautious. That story, which is one standard narrative that will be here forever, for the rest of your life, for the rest of your life you will hear stories about the financial crisis that are this story. Markets ran amok. Capitalism ran amok. The invisible hand broke down. There's a book out called Slapped by the Invisible Hand. Paul Samuelson, and it's about the financial crisis. Paul Samuelson, Nobel laureate, said, now we can finally put to rest these ridiculous ideas of Milton Friedman, who said markets could regulate themselves. Look at what's happened in financial markets. This is what happens when you leave things alone. That is one narrative that you will read constantly, again, for the rest of your life. It will be a standard narrative of the financial crisis. There are other narratives. I want to give you the other narrative based on my understanding of the invisible hand, which is different. My understanding of the invisible hand, by the way, that narrative, the markets ran amok and the invisible hand slapped us, that narrative says we could have stopped it, but we had this bad idea that we shouldn't regulate stuff, and we left the invisible hand to do its work, and it slapped us around. That narrative doesn't hold water for me, because I would argue we did not leave financial markets alone. Now, the standard answer, which I think is not very interesting, is, oh, we regulate markets, financial markets a lot, which is true. But that's not the problem with the invisible hand ran amok story. The problem with the invisible hand ran amok story is that we don't let the invisible hand work in financial markets over the last 25 years for certain players. Not you and me. You and I buy a stock, mutual fund, doesn't work out, we lose our money. That's the way it goes. But for certain players, that's not the way it goes. That's what I wanted to, that's the crony part of crony capitalism. The story starts, you can go back a little further, but the main part of the story starts in 1984, appropriately enough. In 1984, Continental Illinois, how many people here have heard of Continental Illinois? Why? They went bankrupt, but can you get a loan from Continental Illinois? Can you put a deposit with Continental Illinois? No, they're gone. In 1984, they were the 7th largest bank in the United States. Why did they disappear? They made a bunch of investments with borrowed money. They had high leverage. They convinced a lot of people that it would be okay and they should lend them money. They took those loans that they received to invest in stuff that turned out to be risky, which they'd like to do, right? They wanted to use other people's money to get a higher rate of return than they normally get. But they made a mistake, which happens. They made a mistake. The things they invested in weren't as safe as they said they were, thought they were, and they couldn't pay back the people that they had promised money to. So what did they do in that situation? They tried to get more people to lend them money to cover their costs. But they couldn't. They lost confidence, and they were in big trouble. The U.S. government stepped in and wiped out all the stockholders of Continental Illinois, eventually. There's a lot of twists and turns to the first part of the story, but the bottom line is, here's what happened. If you were a stockholder, you lost your money. If you were a creditor, meaning a lender or a bondholder, you got all your money back. Think about what a strange thing that is. You took the group of people who were supposed to be the watchdogs of recklessness, and you said, do-over. You made a bad play. You thought you were going to get your money back and some interest in return. You're not going to. You shouldn't. The things that were done with your money were stupid and dangerous, and you shouldn't have given it to them. But we're going to give you a do-over. We're going to give you your money back. We, of course, did that with the savings and loan crisis as well. In the savings and loan crisis, 99.7% of depositors who had invested in banks that went broke got their money back whether they were insured or not. So a limit on how much insurance is available for a few of them. The limit at the time was $100,000. If you were a depositor with more than $100,000, you should have gotten back every penny. You should have gotten back the $100,000, and everything after that should have been a warning sign, this is a dangerous place to put your money, but they didn't. They gave everybody back all their money. Worse, in 1995, how many people here have heard the tequila crisis? Raise your hand. In 1995, something happened, I wasn't paying, hey, were any of you guys alive in 1995? Yeah, a few of you, but okay, you weren't really reading the financial section of the paper that often, or the Wall Street Journal, or the Economist, or the Financial Times. I should have been. I wasn't really paying attention. In 1995, it was the kind of thing, it's on the Wall Street Journal. It's finance. It's complicated. What it was Mexico suddenly found itself unable to pay back its bondholders, its debtors. They had borrowed money. They were supposed to pay it back. To pay them back, they were going to borrow some more money. All of a sudden, people said, I'm kind of nervous. Maybe Mexico's not going to be able to be solvent. I'm going to stop lending the money. All the past lenders thought, oh my gosh, we're going to lose all our money, or a good chunk of it. The U.S. government stepped in and rescued Mexico. What do? We guaranteed $50 billion of Mexican loans. So people who were worried about about lending to Mexico now didn't have to worry because Uncle Sam, the U.S. government, stood behind those loans. Those loans were paid back. The U.S. government never paid out a penny, and it was called a great success. Who got rescued in 1995? If you read the headlines, you would say, well, Mexico. But that's not who got rescued. Who got rescued were the people who had lent Mexico money and were afraid they weren't going to get it back. Who were those people? Large American financial institutions. They had the incentive to make sure that Mexico stayed solvent. So what the U.S. government did is, they helped Mexico, yes, but they also helped all the people who had lent Mexico money. There were a couple other events. 1998, an event called a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management. It's another story. The Federal Reserve orchestrated a bailout, not with government money, but they got involved and they said that the creditors of long-term capital management, we don't want them to lose their money. So here we have a pattern, and it brings us to March 2008, which some of you might remember, when Bear Stearns couldn't keep its promises. And what did the U.S. government do on that weekend of March 15th, 16th, 17th, whatever it was? They sold off Bear Stearns to J.P. Chase, and J.P. Chase said, we don't want to buy it. They've got all these assets. We don't know if they're any good or not. And the government said, we'll guarantee 29 of the $30 billion of assets. And those assets, by the way, are still on the books of the Fed. We're going to lose, you and I are going to lose money on those. But the government stepped in and said, we're going to guarantee those assets so that J.P. Chase will buy them. But again, that's all smoke and mirrors. Ignore all that. The bottom line is that everybody who had lent Bear Stearns money got all their money back. 100 cents on the dollar. The people who had financed the bad bets that Bear Stearns had made didn't pay a penny. Oh, it's not like, they lost half their money. No. They lost 20% of their money? No. They lost 10%? Not a penny. So we have systematically, for one class is large investors. And by large investors, I don't mean rich people. I mean large financial institutions. We have said to large financial institutions, if you finance activities that go bust through bonds or loans, you'll get all your money back. That's what we've done. There's a couple exceptions. Lehman Brothers and Drexel Burnham. Those are the two large financial institutions we let just go broke, which meant that the people who lent them money didn't get 100 cents on the dollar. They got less. Drexel Burnham, by the way, was a bunch of people who went to jail, so it would be awkward for the government to bail them out. Lehman Brothers, in their bankruptcy statement, their largest creditors were Japanese banks who just don't have quite the same political pull as American banks. So I suspect, I'm not being facetious or sarcastic, I suspect that is part of the reason. No one knows. No one knows. But we have systematically, over the last 25 years, made it easy for people to borrow money. Why? because we made it cheap for lenders to make mistakes. Okay? That's what I want you to understand, the first half of what I want you to understand from today's talk. By doing that, we broke the natural feedback loop that makes the invisible hand work. The profit and loss, we kept the profits in there, but we said, hey, if you lose, do-over. And it's only a do-over if you're a large financial institution. That's the first half of the story. Here's the second half of the story. Why would we do that? Why would we pursue a policy of bailing out lenders if they are large financial institutions and giving them a do-over? And by the way, this is why we do that. While we're doing it, we call ourselves capitalists. There's nothing less capitalist, nothing, than socializing losses and privatizing profit. It's despicable. It's crony capitalism, not the real thing. Why would we do that? Why would George Bush and Hank Paulson say we had to destroy capitalism to save it? Which is basically what they said. There's two answers. I'll give you the standard answer, I'll give you mine. The standard, by the way, we didn't decide anything. It wasn't a vote. It wasn't a consensus. Politics is another kind of invisible hand system. There's a set of incentives. There's a set of feedback loops. Different people making decisions in 1984 that were making them in 1995, that were making them in 2008. But each time, almost every time, not every time, but almost every time when faced with a decision, should I let this financial institution take losses? If they're large, should I let them take losses? No, we said they're too big to fail. They've got to get their money back if they lent the money. If they were bondholders, we want to make sure they get all their money back. So we didn't make that decision. It emerged each time, similarly, as if a memo went out. Memo to Chair of the Fed, Secretary of the Treasury, President of the United States. If a large financial institution made a bunch of loans that didn't work out very well, make sure they get all their money back, 100 cents on the dollar. Why would anybody send that memo? And the one answer is, nobody did. It emerged each time through a set of incentives and feedback loops in the political system that caused that to be the natural response. If you ask the people, why did you do that? Why would that be your natural response? They would have the standard answer, which Ben Bernanke gave, which Hank Paulson gave, which Robert Rubin gave in 1995, which whoever it was, I forget his name, in 1984, the Office of the Comptroller who pushed for the bailout of Continental Illinois creditors. If you ask them, they say, well, we had to. We didn't have a choice. We stood on the edge of a precipice. If that institution had not gotten its money back, as a lender, as a bondholder, then they wouldn't be able to honor their promises. There'd be a set of dominoes. And the whole financial system would fall apart. We'd be in chaos. It'd be the end of civilization. You and I'd be in a loincloth cooking raw meat over an open fire. Life would be nasty, brutish, and short. That's one theory. It could be true. I have some evidence against it. Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. It wasn't the end of the world. Their creditors had to go through court. It took a while, yes. Tied things up. It was unpleasant. It was inconvenient. But it wasn't the end of the world. There wasn't a crisis. Now people say, oh, but look what happened after Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. That's when everything fell apart. Actually, not really. It took a week or so before everything fell apart. Somehow people sat around and went, I guess it's not the end of the world yet. You got a week. No, that's one thing, is the timing's not quite right. The second is that once we bailed out the creditors of Bear Stearns, we told anybody who wanted to lend money to Lehman, don't worry, you look just like Bear Stearns. You got the same crud on your balance sheet. You'll get rescued too. Keep borrowing it. Keep lending it. Keep that machine going. Instead of saying, which we should have done in March of 2008 to Bear Stearns creditors, well, you made a big mistake. Time to pay the price. That's called adulthood. It's called capitalism. We give our kids a do-over, right? You don't give an adult infinite do-overs like we seem to do in the financial sector. So what we said when we rescued the creditors of Bear Stearns, we said, hey, party time, keep it going. If we hadn't done that, people would have stopped lending money to Lehman Brothers. You look at, again, how many people here know what a credit default swap is? Raise your hand. It's impressive. Quick aside for you guys. You look at the credit default swap for Lehman going up to the bailout of Bear Stearns. They're flat. All of a sudden, getting up to the Bear Stearns situation where people start to realize, oh my gosh, these institutions have stuff on their balance sheet that's junk. The credit default swaps, they go up about 3 to 4 times in price, multiple 3 to 4 fold increases in the price of insuring against Lehman Brothers. And then when Bear Stearns gets rescued, goes right back to where it was before. And then it starts to climb again, but it realizes, oh yeah, I guess Lehman is investing in horrible things still. But what do you expect? Who wins from this game and who loses? Oh, so sorry, I wanted to tell you why do I think we did it. So one view is, we did it because we didn't have a choice. By the way, if that's true, we got to stop the system. That's a bad system. If it could be true, it's not capitalism. It's a giant subsidy to the executives in these corporations who can use, in these financial institutions, who can use leverage to look really smart until it falls apart and justify paying themselves large bonuses as these institutions get bigger and bigger. I didn't mention Fannie and Freddie, by the way. They're doing the same thing. They had an implicit promise from the government that turned out to be real, that allowed them to borrow money from China, it turned out. And when it came time for Fannie and Freddie to go bust, we should have said to China, boy, you made a mistake. We told you every time we put legislation about Fannie and Freddie that it is not backed by the U.S. government. But when it came time, it was backed by the U.S. government. So China got all their money back. And everybody who invested in Fannie and Freddie, including my dad, that's nuts. But other people who bought Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac bonds got all their money back, 100 cents on the dollar. So one theory is we had no choice. If that's true, it's a bad system. It's not capitalism. You've got to do something about that. The alternative theory, I think, is what actually happens, which is that the incentives facing these regulators and decision makers are not the ones that would be the ones you would pick. And to help you see that, I'll tell you a quick story. I interviewed for my podcast Joe Nocera, reporter for the New York Times. I said to him, he wrote a book on the crisis, I said, could the crisis have been prevented, and who could have prevented it? He said, let me tell you who could have prevented it. One was Alan Greenspan. He didn't like regulation because he was a free market ideologue, so he didn't like government intervention, and he resisted all attempts at regulation that could have stopped the crisis. Who else? Robert Rubin. He was Secretary of the Treasury. But he was big ego. So when people tried to get the Treasury to regulate derivatives, the person who had that idea, a woman named Brooksley Board, she wasn't nice enough to him. She wasn't deferential enough, and he just ignored her as a punishment. Who else? Ed Gremlin, economist in the Federal Reserve, a governor. What was wrong with him? He's too shy. He understood subprime was dangerous, but he wasn't aggressive enough. I said, so your theory, I didn't say it like this on the show, very polite on the show. So he's not here, so I can be a little more aggressive. And I said, your theory is, we got the free market ideologue who said no regulation, we got the egotist with no regulation, we got the shy person with no regulation. Maybe it has nothing to do with their personalities. Maybe it's the system is against certain kinds of regulation. Regulation that hurts the profitability of these financial institutions. Because that free market ideologue, Alan Greenspan, in 1995 he testified in Congress that we have to bail out Mexico because it's the least worst alternative. The free market ideologue, who supposedly believes in capitalism and government hands-off, said the U.S. government should intervene to guarantee the $50 billion worth of Mexican loans so that the lenders get their money back. Where is his free market ideology then? Maybe he's not a free market ideologue. Maybe he's a free market ideologue when it serves his incentives. But he's an interventionist when it serves him. It's not a principled man. And maybe Robert Rubin faced those same incentives. And here's what those incentives are. Do you know who was the head of the New York Fed in March of 2008 who said we had to bail out Bear Stearns and rescue their creditors? Tim Geithner. Tim Geithner, now Secretary of the Treasury. You know what it's like being head of the New York Fed? You know who's on your board? People from the large New York investment banks, like JP Morgan Chase. What do you think his weekends are like? His weeks, his dinner parties. Who do you think he hangs out with? Who do you think his friends are? Who do you think he wants to make happy? You and me, or them? I'm sure he's a fine person. I'm not suggesting he's a malevolent person. But everything pushes him to believe that we had no choice. Everything pushes him to convince himself that we had no choice, that we stood on the edge of a financial abyss, that we were about to have a catastrophe. So my argument is, if you're the chair of the Fed, if you're a regulator, your natural incentives, the feedback loops that push you. One last example. AIG. AIG owes, at the time of this story, owes Goldman Sachs $9 billion. And the government has decided to let AIG go bankrupt, in which case, see, Goldman Sachs won't get all of its $9 billion, maybe none of it. It's going to be a big fight, and it's going to be tied up with the courts, and they're going to lose some of their money. Or should the government buy stock in AIG and give the money to AIG to pay off Goldman Sachs? And somehow, Hank Paulson convinced, the great capitalist, he calls himself another free market ideologue, somehow he convinced himself that we have to rescue AIG. Could it have something to do with the 24 phone calls he had with the CEO of Goldman Sachs the week before the bailout, where they talked about their summer vacations, how their kids were doing? I think they probably talked about how important it was that AIG make sure it makes its payments to Goldman Sachs. Hank Paulson, after all, was the predecessor of Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO. He was the CEO of Goldman Sachs. Now he's in the Treasury. How do you think, again, I don't know whether I'm naive. I don't really think he sat around this going, ooh, how do I help my old friend back at Goldman Sachs? I don't think it's a mustache twirling story. I think he thought everything he heard said we got to bail him out. So those feedback loops are not the right ones. Let me close and then I'll open it to questions. Adam Smith understood that the goal of people in business is to make as much money as possible. That urge can be productive as long as it is tempered by the feedback loops of profit and loss and competition. Good economists are pro-market, not pro-business, not pro-Wall Street. You know, people say, oh, Wall Street's crucial to America's standard of living. Why? Oh, because they allocate capital to its highest valued use. Since when? Think about it. Since when? Between 1995 and 2005, they allocated capital to the housing market. We poured trillions of dollars into more houses and bigger houses. I do not believe that that was its highest valued use. The feedback loops in that system are broken. So I'm not pro-Wall Street. I'm pro-competition. I'm pro-profit and loss. I'm pro-capitalism. When the government destroys the feedback loops of loss and rewards cronies, the result isn't capitalism, but crony capitalism. Adam Smith and modern economists share a revulsion against the use of government power and taxpayer money to reward cronies. It is bad for capitalism and bad for democracy. I prefer the real thing. Let the invisible hand do its magic, serving the people and not the powerful. Thank you very much.
Where were all the economists involved in this going on? Why didn't we hear from you and others and have the truth told?
Well, I'll tell you I'll tell you a little bit about me, and then I'll talk about the profession at large. I didn't pay any attention to it. I'm a microeconomist by training. I don't know much about finance. Everything you've heard me talk about today, I've taught myself in the last 3 years because I thought, hey, this is a complicated, important problem. I better figure it out as best I can. I paid no attention to the housing market. I believe the people who said it's a small part of all, subprime is a small part of housing. Housing is a small part of the investment world. There's no way it's going to be like the dot-com bubble. The dot-com bubble, a bunch of companies went broke. They lost their money. It wasn't a catastrophe. It wasn't a crisis. Housing was different because so much of it was leveraged, and the result of those bad bets meant not just you had a bad quarter or a bad year, but you were insolvent because you had borrowed that money. Could not cover your promises. So, for me, I was ignorant. However, lots of economists consistently said, they didn't predict the crisis, most of them, by the way, and the ones who did often had the wrong reason. The people who are being lionized today as these brilliant forecasters, to me, are broken clocks. A broken clock is right twice a day by coincidence. It has nothing to do with that it's a good time teller. But a lot of economists understood and wrote in real time, not like I'm doing. I'm telling you a story, and you should be very skeptical of it. You don't know what I've left out. You don't know what I put in, whether it's all true. And every story you hear about the crisis has the same ex post, after the fact, narrative flavor. So I like to look at people who in real time said, this is flawed, this is wrong. In 2004, Gary Stern wrote a book that said, hey, we've induced banks to be risk takers because we've said to them, you get your money back if you can borrow it from folks who are large. And he said, this too big to fail thing's a disaster, we got to fix it. In 2000 or 2001, Josh Rossner wrote a remarkable paper about how Fannie and Freddie were increasingly buying loans that had little or no money down, and that was going to lead to a catastrophe. Numerous economists, Larry Summers, so it's not a left-right issue, numerous economists said that Fannie and Freddie were structurally designed to be destructive, and we have to do something about it. But my favorite is a man named William Guider, who is at the time was a British economist. Recently, he was chief economist at Citibank, but at the time he was in the private sector. And when Mexico was, quote, rescued, meaning the people who had lent them the money were rescued, he said, this is a disaster. This says to folks, you don't have to be careful about who you lend money to. So there were people who said it, but you know, it's like being a bad parent. Your kid comes home, didn't do his homework, gets a bad grade. You love your kid. You give him another chance. If you keep, because you figure, you know, he knows how much I like him. So when he sees me being nice to him, this time he'll say, oh, I'll do my homework because my dad wants me to. How's that work? It can work with enough love and other things on the side. I'd say it's not a good strategy for government regulation. Right? If you continue to give a do-over and say, it won't really make them act recklessly. And by the way, I don't think, make it clear, I do not think that the lenders that I'm talking about sat around and said, I can lend to anything I want because I'll get my money back. That's not what happened. What happened was we dulled the incentive for prudence. We took away the natural feedback loop, which made people pay less attention. They didn't go crazy, but they weren't as cautious as they would be if they had to pay the full price. Other questions? Yeah.
As I understand it, the TAR program is first stop. So can you really say that encourages bad decision making in the same way?
No, the TARP is separate. What I'm talking about, the Bear Stearns is a perfect example. Bear Stearns, in March of 2008, was going to go bankrupt, which meant that anybody who had lent them money, anybody who they had made a promise to, would have to get in line, and there probably wasn't going to be enough to go around, and you would get a fraction back of what you were expecting. What the government did in that case is they said, J.P. Morgan Chase, would you take over the promises that Bear Stearns has made by buying them? Instead of letting them go bankrupt, they said, J.P. Morgan Chase, you buy Bear Stearns, and in the process, honor their bonds and their loans and other things. And they said, well, we'll do it if you'll give us a $29 billion present. The government bought $29 billion worth of the Bear Stearns assets so that J.P. Morgan Chase wouldn't be liable for those. But they were happy to take on all the other ones. Now, the TARP is different. The TARP is hilarious, tragicomic. Right? The TARP is, Hank Paulson goes to Congress and says, the world's coming to an end, I need a blank check for $700 billion. And they said, get lost. Came back a week later. Remember, it passed. By the way, this is just a side note, because I find it, again, more tragicomedy. Somebody said to me, well, they improved it, didn't they? The $700 billion. By the way, it was supposed to be used to buy the toxic assets, so-called toxic assets, on the books of those of a set of large banks. They didn't end up doing that. They just gave them the money. Right? Both of those would help the balance sheet of a bank. Right? And I think they ended up probably doing some of both down the road. But the main thing is they just gave them money as a cushion. My money, your money. made-up money, printed money, money that's going to lead to inflation down the road. Hang on one sec. Important point. Where was I? Help me out. Yeah, what about TARP?
The weed, what happened during the weed?
What?
They tried the first time, a week later,
Oh, they improved it. So how did they improve it? I've read it. It's fun. You know when they say, oh, it's 1,800 pages legislation? It's slight exaggeration. Legislation's got a really big margin on each side. So when it says 1,100 pages, it's really like 600, 400. But I read through a part of it because someone had told me that there was something interesting in it. You know what was in it? A subsidy for, now who would be against this? Green energy. That's very unrelated to the financial crisis. But they put in a page about green energy, and they said certain kinds of green energy will get a subsidy. About, I think it was what, $5,000. If you produce a car that has an electric battery, oh, that's, you could say that could be a good thing. Well, actually, not all electric cars qualify. Just one. Now, that'd be awkward to say in the legislation, the buyers of the Chevy Volt will get a $5,000 check, which is really a check to the Chrysler, right? I mean, to Chevrolet, to GM. So what they said is, it's a special kind of battery. If you have that in that car, you get a $5,000 check. It just happened to be, at that time, only one kind of car had that kind of battery, the Chevy Volt. That's the way it was fixed. Did you know about, how many people knew about that? No, right? A couple people. That's depressing, isn't it? That stinks. That's the way the system works sometimes. Yeah.
It seems to me that all the problems you're describing, a lot of them are just symptoms of fundamental problems with our entire economy and how it's run, especially with agriculture, energy, and infrastructure. And all of those things being hyper-regulated and subsidized, and we see business responses to those systems and how government stuff they're being developed. It's all been responsibility, but essentially,
Yeah, well, again, I don't think of it as a sinister, overarching design. It's just that the natural political incentives work out that way. It doesn't work everywhere. We still have real capitalism in many parts of the U.S. economy. I don't want to suggest we're not Venezuela. That's real crony capitalism. The financial sector, I believe, is coddled. The auto industry, I believe, is coddled. The education system, education industry is coddled. The health industry, coddled. Right? We get benefits. We get subsidies. Now, not all of them get captured by us. So my story today is particularly depressing because I think they go to a very small group of people, somewhat akin to the sugar quotas. Sugar quotas go to literally 5 to 10 families in America. We keep out foreign sugar, and it keeps them rich and makes us poor. Makes us pay more for sugar than we otherwise would. So, half empty, half full. Half empty, oh my gosh, we do what? Half full, well, it's only sugar. So we don't do it with everything. It's true we help the financial sector keep a lot of money that they shouldn't get, but it's only one part of the economy. Yeah, in the back.
What pragmatic solutions would you do, first step? I know that there's a lot of ideological stuff or big things that need to change that experiment. What would you do, as an advisor or as a politician, would you say to somebody to take that first step to alleviate this next problem or look from where we're at right now?
So it's really easy for me, sitting in Charleston, South Carolina on March 23rd, 2011, to say Ben Bernanke's an idiot, right? It's just a cheap shot, right? I don't bear any of the costs for that statement. I say, oh, we should have bailed him out. Easy for me to say. If the world had gone to hell, I'm not the one who paid the price. It had been Ben Bernanke. So I understand why Ben Bernanke was cautious and Hank Paulson was cautious. They, I think, were genuinely worried. So I want to make it clear. It's not like they're not idiots. They're not morons. I think they made the wrong decisions, but I could be wrong, and it's easy for me to say to make the claim because I bear none of those historical costs. Having said that, I think it's weird how many mainstream academic economists and others have said, they didn't have a choice. Why would you say that? Well, because you want to get into the government, I guess. You like being powerful, I guess. So there is a bad incentive structure for my profession as well. But if you ask me, what would I like to think I would do if I had the power? So again, I want to make it clear. Maybe someone would say, a journalist once asked me, if you could be dictator for the day, what would you as an economist do? Well, I wouldn't do good economics because I'd be a dictator. You know, that's what they do. When you get power, you don't act like a good economist anymore. You act like a dictator. What would you do if you were in politics? I'd be a politician. I wouldn't be an economist anymore. I'd assume I'd advocate for the same stupid things that they sometimes do. Stupid from my perspective, good for them because it helps certain people who they are influenced by. But practically, what would I think we should advocate for as American people is to get the government out of the rescue business. If you're going to rescue them, please don't rescue them 100 cents on the dollar. Make them pay some price. When AIG was about to go bankrupt and the government bailed them out again and made sure that the Goldman Sachs got $9.9 billion, why didn't they at least negotiate a partial? This should be, major headline in the news. Tim Geithner said, "Oh no, we can't do that. Can't give them a partial loss. They got to get all their money back." Why? That makes no sense. So at least introduce some pain for bad decisions by large financial institutions. That would be one thing. Ideally, I'd like a world where the Fed did not have discretion to print money and to inject money into institutions because the Fed's a political organization. We have this horrible idea that they're just a bunch of technocrats, independent, unaffected by politics. Again, the head of the New York Fed hangs out with the people he gives money to. It's totally a bad idea. So I get rid of some of that. Yeah, in the back.
Do you think the media today distorted what was going on, what really was going on in these financial markets, distorted and presented an image that wasn't true to the public?
It's hard to know, right? I just gave you a story, right? You're a smart group of people. You're smarter than the average newspaper reader. That story I just gave, if you wrote that in the newspaper, it would be a 10-part, 6-part, multi-thousand-page article. That can't be the headline story after the Bear Stearns weekend. They don't have the time to figure it out. They don't have the space to write it, and the readers wouldn't understand it. Again, I'm not being a snob here. I'm just saying it's complicated. So they did the best they could. I think they did an okay job. But sure, they missed stuff. They always do. They're journalists. They're not economists. They're not financial people. The most sophisticated financial journalists is only a handful who truly understand this stuff. And I don't mean my stuff. I mean just that whole world. It's complicated. I think that's part of the idea of it. I think it's deliberately complicated, partly to make it opaque from people understanding it. Yeah.
What about the rating agencies?
I don't put much stock in that. Here's why. They were paid by the institutions that issued the stuff. Do you think that anybody who bought the stuff believed the AAA? Sure they did. Of course they did. But they had a huge incentive to believe it. Because if they bought AAA stuff, which they bought so-called safe, if they bought stuff that was rated safe, they could use more borrowed money according to the state of regulation. They could use more leverage. So they had a huge incentive to turn a blind eye to the ratings agency's inherent conflict of interest. I don't think they really believed it. They didn't have an incentive to really believe it. So I think that's a bit of a red herring. I've heard that. I'm not convinced by it. Yeah.
This is a bigger question. To what extent do you think Wall Street is secondary?
I think it explains something. It captures the fact that capital got overinvested in this case, housing. It captures the fact that, and John Taylor, who's not an Austrian but has an Austrian flavor to his work, has shown an interesting, provocative, somewhat persuasive case that bad policy by Alan Greenspan and interest rates pushed the housing market to. I just think it's way too complicated. It's too hard. It's too hard. They're different theories. Some of them help us understand some episodes more than others. Some of them might apply at certain times. Some of them may be mostly right. But overall, I would argue, and I would claim that Hayek himself, if you read his Pretense of Knowledge piece, which was his Nobel Prize lecture, he basically says macro's too hard. That doesn't mean there aren't things to understand about macro. That doesn't mean there aren't things that are useful about studying macroeconomics. But I'm skeptical that we will master the complete. It's kind of like saying, no, I'll leave it alone. Other questions? Yeah.
How is Nassim Taleb's work on randomness affected your narrative?
How is Nassim Taleb's work on randomness affected my narrative? I like him a lot. A lot of people like him. A lot of people hate him. How many people here have read anything by Nassim Taleb? Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan. I have 3 interviews with him at Econ Talk. He's a fascinating man. He thinks a lot of himself, so a lot of people don't like him for that reason. I get a kick out of him, and I found his books to be extremely useful in helping me think about self-deception and scientism, the overuse of statistics and fancy techniques to fool yourself into thinking that you understand a system. So that's where it comes into play for me. And that's very Smithian, by the way. That's straight out of the theory of moral sentiments, and it's also very Hayekian. Again, one great reason to read the theory of moral sentiments is his understandings of the weaknesses and strengths of human nature. It's a very rich picture of human behavior and our natures. Great book. And lots of advice in there, by the way, about not to pursue money and not to pursue material wealth, and that it's a false god and it won't make you happy. He's much more complicated than people think.
One last question.
Last question.
I haven't seen it yet, but I'm planning to the documentary Inside Job. They just gave me a bunch. Have you watched it?
I have not seen it. I'm told that a lot of people that I know a little bit, I don't know them well, a lot of famous economists look foolish in it. They were they deserve it. I would never have signed up to be interviewed by those folks because they'll make you look stupid. One of the themes of that is that economists, because they're in the pay of Wall Street and others, had an incentive to turn a blind eye to what was happening. And they pick on free market people in there. But of course, people on the left, Joe Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, wrote a paper about that Fannie and Freddie will never go broke. The odds are 1 in 100 million. And by the way, it's not a bad paper. He only looked at certain things. What he looked at, I thought, was pretty reasonable. He ignored other things. So I think the general phenomenon that economists are co-opted by the system, even though they have a particular political bias, I think that's generally true. But I think there's more to the story. Much more to the story. But there's some truth to that. I don't think we're that important. I think it makes for good theater. I don't think, well, I shouldn't say that. We have enabled, through our defense of these kind of policies and through blind ideology, we've defended some policies that I think were pretty stupid. Yeah. So that part of probably I'd agree with, but I suspect I wouldn't care for the documentary. But I will see it. I hope.